Good.
Have no employee orientation downstairs.
Oh, really?
Is she in the conference room? She's in her office.
Yeah.
It looks like we're recording already. Okay. All right. I'm gonna pause.
Oh, the next speaker. Yesterday she played with it. Can you hear us, Ann?
Yes.
There it goes.
Oh, now I can hear. Man, but it should come through here.
It took a second for that to connect myself.
Voice on.
We're having some audio struggles here. Yeah, again.
Oh,
It's not connecting to this, I don't think.
I got it to work last time.
Did you?
Can you say something, Ann?
yep.
It's just coming
Can you
through
hear
the
me?
regular speakers.
Let me, since you got that working.
You have to select the device and the sound recordings.
Yeah.
Where's Matthew?
EV audio adapter.
There it goes. That's it. Say something, Ann, please.
Yep. Hello. Can you hear me?
No, it's not connecting to that.
Let the engineer know that.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't hear it, but I would have to try.
Here's the,
Well, the second
That's
one
the
that
instructions.
second one on that list, it worked.
yeah.
Second one on speakers.
No?
Yeah, try that one. Can you hear us now?
Yes, we can hear you. We've been hearing you the whole time.
Oh, microphone's using the.
Okay, so it looks like we've got enough people here to get started, and I thought we could start with some welcomes. I don't know if Matt wants to do that. Maybe he just stepped away really quickly, but we do have two new members. Farron Leader is with Lynn Benton Community College, and Farron maybe can just say hello. And then we have Shane Fagan with Veritone Architecture. So we'll have these guys introduce themselves. They're replacing two members who stepped down.
Hi, yeah, and I apologize for being a minute late. I had a student appointment that ran a bit late. I work at Lynn Benton Community College in a position called Affordability Resources Coordinator. My job was created based on some legislation passed in Oregon last year that recognizes a crisis of basic needs insecurity among college students that's causing pretty horrendous dropout rates that haven't been seen since the Great Depression. And so that legislation created a position like mine at every public college and community college in Oregon to start being a person that students can come to when they're experiencing basic needs insecurity, the most common of which among my students is housing. We know from some nationwide surveying in 2019 of about 250,000 college students across the country that 18% of them had experienced homelessness in the year preceding their taking of that survey. That survey is about to be repeated this fall, and I'm pretty nervous about what those statistics are going to look like after 2.5 years of COVID. So I would not be surprised if we're over 20% now. And so as someone who represents the needs and supports for college students who are experiencing those things, here I am. I have ended up wanting to get involved in more local stuff about housing because it's such a crisis level need in lots of ways in our communities, but specifically for the population who I'm working for and who are trying to improve their circumstances in life by working really hard in college. And a barrier that also often gets in their way is housing.
Great, welcome. And Shane, just a quick hello, and we should probably do everybody, but I know we've got to stop on time and have a lot to do. So I'll let Matt take over after this and see how we're doing. I don't see Shane anymore. I don't know where he went.
Yeah, Shane dropped off. I'm going to suggest we do just a quick round of intros, just kind of name and role on the project. Keep it to that, and then we'll kind of jump into the presentation after that. Hopefully we'll get Shane back. And in the meantime, I will sort of suggest 3 people at a time to go next on the intros, and kind of go that way. So myself, Matt Hasty, MIG. I'm the consultant team project manager on this effort, and I will suggest that Kate go next, and then Sharon, and then after that, we'll take the folks in the conference room.
Hi, everyone. Kate Rogers with MIG. I'm a senior planner here and kind of the principal planner on this, this particular project.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Sharon Canopa, and I am former mayor of Albany and city councilor, held those positions for 24 years. But I've also been involved with Albany Partnership for Housing and Community Development, that we provide low-income rental housing in Albany, and that organization's been established since for 31 years.
And I'll start us off in the conference room. I'm Beth Friedlander, and I'm a planner with the city of Albany.
Matthew Rectors, I'm the community development director.
Alex Johnson, second mayor of Albany, city of Albany, Oregon.
Scott Lippman, real estate changer and housing provider through Lippman Properties.
Awesome. Let's go Theodore, Cameron, and Aaron. I'm just going by order on my screen.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ted Bunch, and I am on the Albany Planning Commission and a liaison between the Planning Commission and the Housing Affordability Task Force.
Cameron, you are muted.
There we go. I'm Cameron Settlemeyer, homeowner in Albany. I'm also on the CARA board.
Everybody, my name is Erin Day. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development and Asset Management for Dev Northwest. We are an affordable housing developer. We do work all along the I-5 corridor.
Awesome. All right. How about Patrick, Shane, and Alana?
Morning, everybody. I'm Patrick Wingard with the Oregon Department of Land Conservation Development.
Oh man, did we lose Shane again? He was here. I saw him. All right. Let's see. Alana and Bill and Jonathan.
I'm Alana Carnegie. I am a North Albany resident, homeowner, small-scale landlord. I've been a small-scale landlord since 2015. I'm in my mid-30s, and that's a part of the relevancy too, as well as having connections to disabled and housing insecure folks of my generations.
All right, Bill or Billy, sorry.
Hi there, I am Billy Mcgregor, the new lead transportation planner of AMPO. Technically, I'm here just to keep abreast of current goings on in Albany.
Awesome. Who did I say next? Jonathan, and then Shane, and then Brendan, and then we'll kind of get ourselves going.
I'm Jonathan Balkim. I'm the building official for the city, just here as an observer and staff support.
Shane, you are muted, that you're back. So don't do anything other than unmute.
Perfect. Yeah, sorry, I was having terrible issues with the audio and I literally just got it going about 2 seconds ago. So Shane Fagan, I'm with Veritone Architecture and I'm really excited to be joining you.
Awesome. Welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brendan Buckley with Johnson Economics. I am part of the consulting team on this project, and my firm is just adding some technical analysis and some insight on real estate markets and that type of thing to the project.
All right, thanks, Brendan. And I will just note, Brendan told me he had his COVID booster yesterday. He's not at quite 100%. So he's going to be here to kind of help chime in on stuff and support Kate and I when we present things. But he's going to keep a low profile other than that, given all that. So thanks for being here, Brendan. And yeah, we'll check with you if you just have anything to add to things Kate and I say as we go through. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. This meeting is going to be structured very similar to the last meeting we had with you all. So did the welcome. We'll do just kind of a quick, the main focus of the meeting is to review the background report part 2. So we reviewed strategies and questions we had for all of you in the first part of that report the last time we met, and it focused in large part on strategies related to updates to the city's development code. Today we're going to be focusing on some incentive-based strategies as well as funding sources and programs and partnerships. We're going to kind of walk through a presentation in each case for each strategy, and there are quite a lot of them, as Ann said. Hopefully you all got a chance to take a good look at the report we sent out. But in each case, we'll try to give you a real quick overview of the strategy. And then we have some questions for you all. We tried to come up with some fairly targeted questions related to specific strategies. Some of them just have to do with, hey, are we on the right track in terms of the priority level we identified for the strategy? In other cases, we want to hear from you about, one or more options in terms of how these strategies might get implemented. And so we'll kind of walk through things, ask you those questions, talk about hear from you on that, and then kind of move on to the next strategy. So that's kind of how we'll organize the meeting. We want to make sure we reserve time at the end. If there's anybody who's joining us who's not part of the task force. So hang in there. If anybody's on the call and listening in and has things to add, you'll get to kind of hear the conversation and then have time to chime in at the end. And then if we go through this really quickly and we get a lot of good focused discussion and we have time, we have potentially a question or two to ask you about some upcoming community engagement, give you a sense of that. So if we have time, we'll talk about that and then just do a quick wrap up and next steps. And I will say a couple of folks on the meeting, including myself, have a hard stop at 1 p.m. So we will need to wrap up by then, and we'll just kind of do our best, and hopefully we'll get through everything and get good feedback and guidance and discussion from all of you. So with that, we'll kind of jump into it. And I'll say that in terms of presenting the information and asking about strategies, Kate and I will sort of tag team on that. I'll cover the first couple categories and she'll cover the last one. So that's kind of how we'll do that. So you guys get to see this slide every meeting. It just kind of shows you the process and where we are. So we're at this point of reviewing the second portion of the draft strategy analysis and implementation plan. And based on what we heard from you last time and today, we'll be then refining that plan, kind of continuing to refine and tweak the priorities and the recommended implementation actions associated with each strategy. And then again, we've got some community engagement activities coming up. So we'll give you kind of a quick overview of that at the end of the meeting, assuming we have time. And then the next step will really be to have a briefing with Planning Commission and Council, and then move into have one more meeting with you all early 2023, and then move into the adoption phase. So that's just kind of where we're headed at this point. All right. So again, kind of the last time we talked, we reviewed strategies related primarily to the development code, as well as kind of the supply of land that's planned and zoned for housing, and talked about those things. And again, today we're going to focus on financial and regulatory incentives, a little bit of overlap on some of those between development code strategies, and then funding sources and programs and partnerships. So I didn't count the total number of these, but pretty decent number. And again, we've got these initial priorities identified for strategies, high, medium, and low. So in some cases, we're going to just kind of check in with you about, hey, do you agree with those relative priorities? Even things that are low priorities, it doesn't mean that it's not important. It really is more about kind of level of resources and timing to devote to implementing those strategies. So when we say low, that's really kind of what we're talking about, is some things might be low because we think they're a longer term strategy and not kind of ready to implement immediately. So I'll just kind of make that comment. All right, so I'm not going to read this list, but this is the list of financial and regulatory incentives that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. And I'm just going to go through sort of my little review of each of these fairly quickly, and then get to sort of asking you all the questions that we have for you. So the first one is about pre-approved plan sets for different types of middle housing and accessory dwelling units. This is something that a number of communities around the state do. They basically kind of have these pre-approved plan sets. If somebody comes in with one of those, it's a pretty short review process. So it's really intended to kind of reduce the burden, particularly for smaller developers or homeowners, to be able to propose to build and build these types of housing. So that's kind of the benefits of this strategy. Kind of on the challenges side, developing such a program and the materials and information and the pre-approved plans, is going to take some time and resources for the city. And I guess given that there would be sort of a limited number of these pre-approved plans, result in some repetitiveness in terms of, what that housing looks like. But you see that kind of with any type of housing to some degree anyway. So, kind of difficult to avoid. And then changes to those plans would require a standard permit. So those are kind of the pluses and minuses of this one. Next one, just some examples of kind of what we're talking about. City of Portland does this, the city of Eugene does this, particularly, I think Oregon City might also do this for accessory dwelling units in particular. So this just kind of gives you a sense of, what some of those pre-approved plans tend to look like. And they're always designed to meet the specific regulatory requirements of the given jurisdiction. So they would be tied to your standards for accessory dwelling units or cottage cluster housing, or any other type of middle housing that you allow for in residential areas. So kind of the question is, one, given what we've said about the pros and cons, this is actually listed as question 2, but do you think this should be a kind of low to medium priority? And then if the city were to implement this, what types of housing do you think the city should target to this strategy, if any? And so those are the things that we want to hear from you about. If you have other questions, we'd love to hear those. Farron has her hand up, and then I'll just kind of, Kate and Ann and I will keep our eye out for other hands up, either physically on the screen or with the symbol there. So yeah, Farron.
Yeah, Matt, my question was actually a clarifying question from the previous slide about the cottage clusters being a square footage of 1,500 to 1,900. Is that lot size or dwelling size? Because 1,500 to 1,900 square foot dwelling is like twice the size of the house I currently live in. And so that seemed rather large for something that would be called a cottage. And I wanted to clarify again, is that lot size or dwelling size?
That's dwelling size. That's specific to the city of Portland standards for that type of housing. And I don't recall exactly what Albany's threshold is for size of cottage clusters. So again, this is really going to be tied to whatever the city's existing standard is. We're not going to propose changes to that standard as part of this process. The question really is this a good idea, having these pre-approved plans and using those to help kind of reduce barriers or costs of pursuing them? So,
Okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
And I can clarify, the city of Albany has smaller limits on square footage for cottage clusters. I think we landed on 1,400 square feet as the maximum, and then there's an average that's a little lower. So there has to be kind of some smaller units combined with some of the larger units. And also I should point out that this Portland program is actually, it's an older example and it's not currently in effect. But it was one example of a middle housing approach where they had these kind of prototypes of middle housing development. I don't know of any other communities in Oregon yet that have adopted this for middle housing specifically.
Okay, awesome. Erin.
Yeah, I think this is great, and I definitely think it should be prioritized. I think one of the things that probably should be noted about it is that there are no sort of public funding sources that kind of favor or encourage this type of development. So I think that what this would do is it would start to kind of fill in that gap more for market rate housing than sort of low income housing. Obviously, you would touch like multi-generational housing and other areas that are not being captured, but there are no public funding sources right now that would, necessarily call out the development of this type of housing. So you'll see this in the private market. Maybe that'll change over the next few years, but there isn't really any discussion right now at the state level to put any funding sources in place that would favor this, public funding sources in place that would favor this type of housing for nonprofits, for example.
Yeah, really good points. Thank you. I'll take Jonathan and then Sharon.
So as the group is working on recommendations, one consideration, because you had mentioned what housing types you'd want to focus on, is we do also have statutory limitations on what has to be done by an architect versus what doesn't. So like single family, we don't have to have designed by an architect where, once we get into multi-family situations, so some of the things that land use is referring to as middle housing may trigger architecture requirements from a registered design professional. So as we're balancing what you would like the city to focus on, you may take that into account, because that would obviously increase the costs. And potentially, would the architectural firm be willing to allow their copyright to be used multiple times, and basically their liability that way. So I would consider that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Do you think, just quick follow-up, that accessory dwelling units, would they sort of be more similar to single family detached versus middle housing types or multifamily?
Correct. From a building code perspective, we look at an ADU as just a single family dwelling. So generally the ADUs, duplexes, and townhouse from the building code perspective, so just 3 units or more attached, separated by the ORSC's requirements, would be generally a safe area to target. Once you get into true multifamily, where we're going out of the commercial code, that's where you start crossing into it. Likely will need to be designed.
Okay, that's great. That's super helpful. Thank you. Sharon.
Well, I have some reservations on even going this route, and I mean, mostly even for staff to be putting kind of energy into what type of housing really should look like, and if it's going to be more of a standard, because whatever would be set as an example for this of like a pre-approved plan might not fit in a historic district. It might not fit in an existing housing that has, say, mid-century homes. It might not fit in some of the other newer neighborhoods. So I think if somebody wants to go down the path of having an ADU, they need to be able to fit within their neighborhood and be something that's compatible with the neighborhood. So I have reservations to even put any kind of energy into this.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Yeah, I will just sort of say that the city does have sort of limitations on what it can do in terms of requiring specific architectural design standards for ADUs. They really need to be clear and objective standards. So let's kind of note that. So it can't be sort of just compatible with, but they need to be pretty specific. So I think, and that's the case with really any kind of housing. But I think, yeah, good points in terms of sort of saying, here's the kind of design we agree with or approve of or something like that. So yeah, appreciate the comments. Anybody else on this one?
Cameron has his hand up.
Yeah, Cameron, go for it.
So one thing I wanted to mention real quick is if you do a design standard itself, it may not fit, you know, having a generic standard or a couple standards may not fit in a particular lot, particularly for like a detached ADU. And if you're a large city like LA, which does have these, it makes sense to devote staff time because, you know, there's a lot of different properties where it may not fit on some, but there'll be enough that it does fit on. It makes sense. For a smaller city like Albany, I do question if it's going to be best use of staff time to do something like this, because I don't know that there'll be a lot of lots, you know, as far as setbacks where it would fit. And, you know, again, a homeowner, an individual homeowner, if they're looking to do something like this, they may want a design that they like that fits with their lot, not just something, you know, cookie cutter of a standard. And so I would say that this tends to be a lower priority just because I don't know that we're going to get a good return on value as far as staff time on this.
All right, thanks for those comments. I would just kind of note a couple quick things. One, these would not be things that somebody would be required to use. It would be sort of available if the city were to kind of go down this route. And the other thing I would note is that even in using these, they'd still have to meet those setback requirements and other requirements. So, but you're right, that could sort of limit the utility of it. So appreciate all the comments on that. And also just sort of, you know, whether this is something city should spend staff resources on. Erin, do you have another comment or is your hand up from that earlier one?
Sorry, it was from earlier. I'll take down. My bad.
No worries. Just wanted to check. Okay, well, I would say, yeah, any other comments? Sorry about that.
Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, this is Scott Letman. I'm a real estate appraiser, and the secondary mortgage market doesn't really know how to deal with ADUs, how to finance them. Is it a duplex? Is it income producing property because there's 2 units? Is it single family? And if it's single family, where are the comparables that you use to support the value? So that the financing of an ADU isn't particularly ironed out yet. And I think that contributes why they're not for market acceptance.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments on this one? So I'm just going to kind of recap what I think I heard. One, I heard that doing this could, you know, provide a certain amount of support for these types of housing units when there's not going to be necessarily sort of support in other sort of financial or funding ways coming from the state necessarily, let's say. But there is also some concern among some folks about putting a lot of staff time and resources into this for a number of reasons. One, kind of utility. Two, promoting a specific design for housing. Good comments on just some things if the city was to move forward with this, they would have to think about in terms of particularly doing this for middle housing types that would fall into the multifamily category, and just, you know, how well these are going to be used by different folks. So I think that's all good food for thought and for us to help kind of refine the strategy as we move forward. So yeah, unless there's anything else, we'll kind of keep going, and, you know, we'll likely, to the extent we move this forward, make some tweaks to it. And we're not, I think at this point, necessarily trying to take many things off the table here, but do want to get a sense of, you know, what are the challenges in implementing things or the benefits, and, you know, relative priority related to that. So I'll just note that. All right. So tax abatements, there are several programs authorized by the state of Oregon to allow for abatement of property taxes for certain types of housing. This can be a really important program or tool, particularly for developers of housing that's affordable to people in lower incomes or even moderate incomes. It can also sort of support other policy objectives around development of mixed use housing. And it can help encourage even some market rate projects to move forward and incorporate affordable units, again, in mixed use areas or downtowns. So I have often heard from providers that this is a pretty important tool kind of in the toolbox for them. So I'll just note that. The downside, of course, is because it is a tax abatement program, it results in some loss of income to the city and or other taxing districts that are part of this this implementation of the strategy, because you need to have the taxing districts that make up 51% or more of the kind of the tax bill to sign on to be able to implement this. So that's really kind of the main issue or con with this. The programs do 2 out of 3 that we're going to talk about kind of sunset after a certain period of time, 10 years. So it's not in perpetuity, but it is for a certain period of time. So those are kind of the highlights of that in that regard. So there's 3 specific programs that we noted here. One applies to low-income rental housing. Another is really to kind of any multi-story housing. And that's often going to be in the city's downtown or mixed-use areas. The city's got more flexibility in terms of, how they apply that in terms of housing affordability levels. And then the third one is related to transit supportive, essentially multifamily housing within designated transit corridors or areas that support transit. And again, the city's got some flexibility in terms of how they identify or apply affordability requirements for that one. The first one, exemption lasts for 20 years, the other 2 for 10 years. And I'll just maybe stop and see if Brandon or Kate have anything to add to my pretty quick summary of those 3. Or Ann. Okay, so kind of the next slide. So really kind of the discussion here is, do you support future continued consideration or future consideration of these types of programs? And, all 3 specific ones, staff and the project team has identified this as a relatively high priority, given how important it can be to making certain types of projects pencil out. So we want to know if you support this as a relatively high priority strategy. And the last thing I'll just note is that in terms of how this gets implemented, it can be done on either a project specific basis, or the city can pass an ordinance or resolution that says, hey, if somebody comes along and they meet all the eligibility requirements associated with this tax abatement, then we are going to support this with our, sort of taxing district partners. So those are kind of the 2 ways cities kind of ultimately implement this one. So I'll stop there and got Sharon and Cameron and Aaron.
Okay, I strongly support the tax abatements, but also it needs to be for a nonprofit that's going to be able to have the means and the tools to make sure that the rents are going to end up being certified so that they do fall within the low income tax low income bracket. That is challenging for you. So, you couldn't just have, say, somebody wanting to build an apartment complex and say, okay, we're going to keep the rents down, when you have to be able to make sure they're complying with those income eligibility, which takes a separate level of staffing that's going to be able to make sure that they're income certified. So Albany Partnership or Lynn Benton Housing Authority goes through Oregon Housing, and you have a annual certification process that you have to go through the state that makes sure that your tenants there do qualify. So with that, I think the program can be established to be tax exempt. Benton Housing Authority already is, because it is owned through the county, so they get full tax exemption. Albany Partnership, three of our other properties are tax exempt. One is not at all, and a couple others are only the city portion to it. But the ones that we have, the three are for the life of the property. So I would not be for putting a time frame on that, exempting it up to 10 years or 20 years. If they are an established low-income housing provider, that's a nonprofit that goes through that certification process, then it should be for the life of that property, as long as it is staying as low-income income eligible for the tenants. So I think this should continue, but I wouldn't want a time frame on it. But I would also want to make sure that who's providing that housing is one that's going to be going through the income certification process.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. Great comments in terms of implementation. I think in terms of the timeframes, we just want to make sure that the city would be allowed to have an extended timeframe given the statutory requirements associated with the program. So I think, yeah, good thing to think about. So
right.
Awesome.
I mean, one of our properties has been tax exempt, and that's been for since 1995. So looking at this, if you do a 10-year or 20-year, ours would have been out of that exemption. So
great.
So
All right.
Matt, I think it looks like maybe Anne has her hand up. I think it would be helpful to clarify what the city's current tax abatement program is for nonprofit organizations. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Kate. I was just going to clarify that right now the city does have a tax abatement program, but it requires annual renewal, and we're actually supposed to get, an application every year for that. So the Albany Partnership properties that Sharon mentioned, every year the city council has to decide whether they're going to continue that tax abatement. So it's not an automatic lifetime. What the low income rental housing tax exemption does is it doesn't require you to have to go back to council every single year. It's just an automatic 20 years, which really helps in those early years. And it does save staff time and concern whether or not you're going to get that tax abatement from year to year.
Awesome. Thank you, Anne. Yeah, that's great, Bo, to have. Let's see, Cameron and then Aaron, and then we'll see if anybody else has comments on this one.
So doing a tax abatement for the low income rental housing, yeah, that makes total sense to me. As far as the vertical housing and the transient, well, that would need to be tied in to, like, say, less than 60% AMI or some kind of standard like that. Otherwise, if you don't tie it to something that's affordable, then you're just subsidizing, high-end luxury condos. Coming from having spent a year down in the Bay Area where they're putting up, 9-story apartments and condos everywhere. If you subsidize that, it's, you're subsidizing, luxury apartments basically, and you're doing nothing to help low income. So whether I support the second two or not depends on whether they're tied into, like less than 60% AMI or some kind of similar standard where it's actually going to help low income and not just subsidizing development.
Yeah, great comments. Thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, totally agree with what everybody has said so far. I think that for low income housing, for sure. Also, just what Sharon was saying, just to reiterate, those compliance standards as you go over time get pretty laborious. It's gonna be a pretty heavy toll on Albany staff trying to keep up with those compliance. And also there's not a whole lot of ways to deal with folks who are non-compliant. Also, I would disagree with Sharon in terms of the lifetime of the building, and I would tie the affordability period to whatever the affordability period is on the maximum affordability period on the initial funding of the source. So that way, if the building has 40 years of affordability or 60 or 100, it's not uncommon for buildings to sometimes transition after a 40-year period or a 60-year period into market rate housing. So I just think that it would be easier to tie it to the funding source itself and let OHCS track that for you all, instead of you all having to do that And I also agree with what Cameron just said. I think that if you're gonna do for the second two, if you're gonna do those, you need to tie them to a certain AMI. And I'd probably, I mean, just same comment with Sharon, that's gonna be really tough to track long-term. And so just, I don't know if you wanna prioritize folks who are going through public funding sources or not. That's a decision for the city of Albany, but just as somebody who manages our assets, we've got about 40 properties in our portfolio, and almost all of them have tax exemptions. And if we lose the tax exemption, we do have to have hard conversations about whether or not we can keep that property in our portfolio. Especially when you get later on in the developments, the feasibility of the site can get pretty close to the line. So those property tax exemptions matter.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Any other comments about this one? Then I'll kind of sum up what I think I've heard.
Yeah, we've got some comments in here, Matt.
All right.
This is Scott. So these are alternatives that are approved by the state, right? And you can debate how they be implemented. But one thing I was thinking, water and sewer bills are more than property taxes. If you're operating an apartment building, not a little bit, but a lot. And that would be something that the city could eliminate on a property, because the marginal cost to supply more gallons of water or more sewer treatment is nominal in relation to the entire community. So in my opinion, it wouldn't cost the community much. You wouldn't have to burden the other taxing districts with their loss of revenue. And it'd be a lot simpler because it'd be internally managed by the city.
So you want to get rid of the water and sewer bills?
On properties that for low income, well, to lessen the burden and make it more financially feasible for the project, right? You eliminate the water and sewer bills on targeted projects.
But I could support that, but it should be recertified though. I mean, it should have some kind of revisit, like I signed the documents for the projects that.
Well, you can determine your criteria.
Right. I think when I signed the ones for Sharon's Albany partnership every year since I've been mayor, I'm sure she signed them before then. So I think recertification is important. Water and sewer, we have to discuss what would be the hit, right? And there should be a process to review those people in that situation. I think they should pay something, maybe not eliminate everything, but pay something. I mean, that's part of the whole, pride and ownership, because they're paying maybe say 10% or whatever of their water bill or 20% of their water bill.
I'm talking about like an apartment.
Oh, project. Apartment complex. Okay.
Apartment complex that to provide low income housing.
Okay.
So I'm gonna interrupt just a bit to note that one of the other strategies we'll talk about in this meeting relates to systems development charges associated with water and wastewater, sewer and stormwater. So we will talk about that a little bit more specifically. It's not necessarily tied directly to sort of monthly bills for water or sewer, but it is tied to the costs associated with that. So we can maybe continue the conversation about that strategy when we get to talking about those systems development charges. But just kind of wanted to note that that's going to come up later in the conversation as well. So, but yeah, good comments on that. Anybody else on this one? All right, so I think kind of what I've heard from the folks who have commented is generally support for these types of programs, although for vertical housing and transit supportive, that there ought to be some tie to affordability requirements there. So if the city's thinking about implementing those types of tax exemptions, that's important to look at. And then also to think about and look at what is the abatement period for these programs, that it's potentially beneficial to have it go beyond just the kind of statutory time periods. And one way to think about that would be to tie it to the the time period associated with the funding mechanism. And I think then we also heard that, yes, this one does take staff resources, that there are existing organizations who do that certification process. And that I think probably, or maybe there's a potential to partner with them in terms of that aspect of the process, but just acknowledgement that that this one comes with some needed commitments in terms of staffing resources. So it sounds like this one should remain a relatively high priority based on what I've heard or what we all have said so far. But any other comments on that before we jump to the next one? Does that make sense?
This is Scott again. I apologize. Because land use planning in Oregon is an experiment anyway, taking away one of the toolbox items is vertical housing development zone from our recommendations, because in the future, particularly in the downtown area, it's very difficult to go vertical. It's very expensive. And if there was some kind of incentive, I don't know, it may be different than the low-income housing incentive. I think that would be helpful to be retained and not eliminated.
The vertical, you mean?
The vertical, yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't hear anybody say we should eliminate that from the toolbox, more that we should, in terms of implementing that strategy, think about tying it to some affordability requirements. And I will just note that some cities in implementing that one don't require that all the units be affordable, but that a certain percentage of them be affordable to get a certain level of exemption or abatement. So I would just kind of note that. So yeah, but great comments. Any other ones before we kind of move on? All right. So, we got right to it. SDC, or Systems Development Charge, deferrals, exemptions, or reductions. So this gets a little bit to the comments from Scott and the mayor related to costs related to water, sewer, parks, and transportation services. So this is really focused on the systems development charges that the city assesses at the time of typically connection to facilities or services. So there's some different ways to look at reducing costs associated with SDCs. So we're going to talk about those. I think there might be 2 or 3 slides on this one. So again, I'll kind of go through them fairly quickly. Obviously the main benefit here is that reduces costs associated with the development of housing, and those costs can be not insignificant, I will say. On the flip side, those charges have been determined or calculated by the city in terms of how much money is needed to pay for wastewater treatment facilities or water storage facilities or other types of facilities that are needed based on to accommodate new growth. So if there are reductions in the revenue coming in from those charges, then the city needs to find a way to make that up. They need to backfill it through another funding source, or they end up not having enough money to build the facilities that they need and that everybody needs to continue to provide those services. So those are kind of the flip sides of this one. Let's see, next one. So we'll talk about these different options. So one is to defer when the charge is paid. And potentially delay payment until certificate of occupancy rather than at the time the building permit is issued. So this doesn't reduce the revenue, it just sort of changes the timing of when the money comes in, but that can be helpful in terms of kind of the carrying costs of that development. So it can have a beneficial impact on reducing costs. And it can also be combined with financing of SDC payments so that they can be paid over a certain period of time. Again, that's just going to kind of reduce some of the carrying costs associated with that, and can ultimately, again, improve the financial feasibility of those projects. So deferrals is one option. Next one. Reductions or adjustments to the methodology. So one way to look at this is that SDCs are related to the relative impact of residential or commercial development on the need for these types of facilities. And to the extent that smaller housing units have lower impacts on the system, because they've got a smaller footprint, fewer people living in them, they typically would have a lower impact on the need for those new facilities. And some cities kind of scale their SDCs related to dwelling sizes and have reduced fees or charges for middle housing or multifamily housing. And this is something that the city's actually currently proposing to do as they update their SDC methodology. The methodology is just kind of how they calculate what the fee is and how it's applied to different types of development. So that's what that means when we say that. So right now they're already kind of looking at implementing this strategy. So we wanted to kind of point that out and just note that as part of this process, Anne and Matthew have been having conversations with other folks at the city in the Public Works and Engineering Department about kind of how this could get rolled out. So I'll note that one. Next one is exemptions. So in this case, for certain types of development, SDCs could be essentially exempted, or those developments could be exempted from SDCs. And this can be done for, could be done potentially for instance, regulated affordable housing, to again, improve the ability of those projects to be financially feasible. Some cities exempt or significantly reduce SDCs for accessory dwelling units, because with those in particular, the SDCs can make up a larger percentage of the cost of the project, given that the relative cost per unit of ADUs is lower than for other types of housing. But I'll note that, you know, this can be challenging, particularly in terms of being able to backfill revenues, and in terms of kind of these conversations with city staff, I think generally would be supportive if there is our funding sources identified that can backfill the lost revenue associated with exemptions to SDCs. So that's been the conversation so far amongst the staff and team. So the questions for you all, I mean, one, we just want to note that the city supports allowing deferral. That was another conversation we've had with other city staff. And so do you agree with that? And second question is, do you think the city should pursue exemptions if they can identify a funding source to backfill those exemptions? We'll talk about a construction excise tax strategy in a moment, because that, or in a few minutes, that's one of the ways these could be backfilled. And then if you do support exemptions, you know, for what types of housing do you think it would be appropriate to apply those exemptions? Accessory dwelling units, regulated affordable housing, or other types? So those are the questions for y'all. So that was a long one. Sorry about that. And I see we've got Shane, Aaron, Cameron, and Alana with hands up. So let's take you all, and then we'll see if anybody else in the conference room or elsewhere has comments on this one. Shane, go for it. There you go.
All right. Yeah, so I am definitely on the deferral side. I think that's a great way to have that initial way for development to pencil out to start with, and then get to the actual place of it making money. The all-out exemption, I feel like that could be difficult, especially if depending on the building type, and that happens to change, where you start to have it go back to market rate. The city then wouldn't have a method to come back and get those fees again. So I think that I'd really go more towards the deferral, and that could go on to any of the building types.
Great, thanks, Shane. Yeah, Aaron.
I'm just going to speak on behalf of the publicly funded projects, because I have a lot of opinions about the other thing, but I'll stick with publicly funded projects. So deferrals won't do anything for a publicly funded project, because we have to build in those fees. We have to secure funding sources for those fees no matter what, no matter when they come into the project. Also paying at certificate of occupancy versus at the beginning, it's still in the same stage of development from a financing perspective. Even if we could defer it even longer into the property, it would throw off our DCR, our debt coverage ratio, which is one of the hardest things to kind of keep intact when getting our funding approved. That would be particularly hurtful for permanent supportive housing projects because the DCRs on those the benchmarks are pretty hard to fill. So I would not, at least for a publicly funded project, a deferral really wouldn't mean anything. Most of the other jurisdictions where we work have exemptions. So just if Albany is taking a look at some of the other areas at least for publicly funded affordable housing projects. Big fan of exemptions, obviously, for publicly funded projects. I think they, as you mentioned, it's really helpful. It can sometimes be as much as some of our small gap funding sources. So would definitely incentivize publicly funded projects if there were SDC exemptions.
All right, thank you. Cameron, and then I've got Alana, and then Sharon, and then Jonathan.
So I think that doing SDC exemptions for nonprofits that are, doing a specific affordability project makes sense. For everything else, it seems like the best thing to do is what the city is already talking about doing, and that is scaled system development charges. One of the big downfalls we have right now is the availability of entry-level homes that people can start to pass to home ownership, which if you're not a homeowner, then you're ultimately always paying rent indefinitely. And so we need to scale SDCs to encourage the building of very small, like say 6 to 1,000 square foot homes like they used to build. And encourage that through system development charges. So if you're doing say an 800 square foot home, your system development charges, they may not be exempt, but they'll be, very low, a fraction of what they are today, versus if you're building a 4,000 square foot luxury home, then the system development charges to help pay for the subsidizing of the small homes, your charges on that are going to be, several times what they are currently. So I would like to see a very aggressive scaling of system development charges based on the size on a per unit basis.
All right, thank you. Great. Okay, Alana, Sharon, and Jonathan. And then I'll go to the...
Building on what Cameron just said, I also agree with a more aggressive scaling. I don't know that the 0.9 that's mentioned in the packet is how significant or not that is. But I wanted to specifically comment on two things in relationship to this. Working with reducing SDC costs was a big thing that we heard from developers in the listening sessions, et cetera. And it is mentioned in the packet about in this section that House Bill 2001, the middle housing bill, encourages municipalities, et cetera, to look at SDC deferrals for middle housing types. And the passage of that bill and the work done to implement code changes, et cetera, in Albany related to that is trying to help make it easier, but doesn't actually incentivize the building of those middle housing types at all. So again, like with what Karen was saying, if the SDC exemptions or reductions could be specifically applied to affect middle housing types, cottage clusters, duplexes, quadplexes, et cetera, that could be a way that we could actually incentivize that type of development. And I think there are a lot of people who, on the low income side of things, don't want to be paying rent forever, would like an opportunity to own and or don't like living in apartments. We have all of our low income people, including our disabled community members living in apartment buildings. They're stuck on the 3rd floor, they never get outside, and their health deteriorates. So I really want more types, and this seems like one of the ways to incentivize those types.
Awesome, thanks, Alana. Yeah, Sharon, and then Jonathan, and then I think Anne has her hand up as well.
So I've seen over the years many times, and it's usually just certain individuals that'll just basically whine about SDCs, how it is just, the end of the world, basically, that the city charges SDCs. But if a project cannot afford SDCs, which are actually minor over the overall building cost, then they cannot afford a project. So I would not be for exempting SDCs. Now, deferring until occupancy permit, that is something that could be an option. I mean, there could be certain projects that basically they, within their financing, if they wanted to kind of finish off their financing, making sure they have enough for their project. It's something that can be, it's kind of a feel good sort of, offer to do for deferring it. But to exempt it, I have seen this over the years, and it's been many nonprofits have come forward wanting to, for any certain project, has wanted to have an exemption. And the city's just never gone down that route to kind of open up that Pandora's box. But I believe the city is looking at doing more of a tiered approach. So if it ends up being more of a lower income, smaller, housing, then it's going to be more on a tiered basis. And I think that we need to let that play out and see how that works for housing projects. So if it's a square footage and it's going to end up being smaller, then they're going to be paying a smaller amount instead of just paying per bedroom, per bathroom, across the board, whether that bathroom could be a, 100 square foot bathroom up to a 500 square foot bathroom, they always pay the same. So, so I would really not want to open up the door on exempting SDCs.
All right, thank you, Sharon. Jonathan, and then Ann, and then we'll see if the folks in the conference room have any comments on this one too.
So my comments just going to be limited to the tie to the certificate of occupancy. So one thing you'll want, if that recommendation continues to go forward, the one thing you'll want to work with is, especially with our partners, maybe even Drive Northwest a little bit, since they've done this quite a bit over their development time, is making sure any wording is correct to where it doesn't interfere with the funding stream. I know in previous endeavors, temporary certificate of occupancy may not allow a lender to release the funds that would then need to be paid off to get the certificate of occupancy. So it could become a chicken and an egg type format. And then in the same sense, I would caution to a small point that the building code and the certificate of occupancy that it's tied to is a separate state agency that sometimes operates as its own situation. So there have been times in the past where system development charges and other things have come to head against the building code, and previous administration had basically advised to issue certificate of occupancies because we are in charge of just the building code, not the rest of the elements. So there is some caution in those types of situations, because a different state agency may say, nope, you can't hold it up. So just caution.
Yeah, great comments. I think, yeah, we absolutely don't want to this to be an impediment or a barrier, right, to how certain projects move forward. So I think really good thoughts for if this gets implemented, some things we need to be thinking about. Ann, what do you got?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you can go to the council meeting materials website and watch the beginning of the September 12th work session. Rob Emmons with Public Works did a really good presentation on how the SDCs are being scaled. The methodologies will be adopted at their next council meeting, September 28th. And also in that presentation is a discussion of what the fees are proposed to be set at with the new scale methodology, which would support smaller dwelling types and some middle housing types. So I would just encourage you to look at what is going to be adopted very soon now. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, that's in process. And if folks have specific comments on it, it sounds like now is kind of the time to check into that process and provide comments in that way as well. So let's see, Matthew, does anybody in the conference room have any additional comments on this one?
So I actually did as well. So Ann, thank you for bringing that up. I did ask for a presentation Rob Emmons did to be sent to this body, or myself or you, and you send it out to everyone. But the scale in the SDCs, there's some significant reductions in costs for building smaller homes. I think that's going to help incentivize builders to at least build a smaller residence or single family. There's also at the bottom of the matrix, it shows for multifamily or apartment buildings and duplexes. So there is some data there, and I'll make sure we get that out to everyone. And so they did a really good job explaining how those how the fees are set up. But I think people, for a large part, would be happy with what they see. I know that the builders I've talked to about it, they're seeing satisfied, or at least is lower than it was before in the past. And so I think that it's going to be a good move forward. Now, exemptions, like my counterparts on this commission or this task force, I don't think exemptions are the way to go. But deferrals or financing or delaying, I think that's an option we should probably consider more seriously.
All right, thank you. Anybody else on this one before I kind of summarize and
This is Scott Letman again. In looking at your packet, I don't see really anything that's significantly going to increase affordable housing. And how it's going to be implemented. And because there's a certain segment of the population that is chronically challenged for housing, I would consider having an exemption as an option, particularly since some of the SDCs are for things that are already sunk costs. We've already built a water treatment plant. We've already built a sewer treatment plant. Buying into a sewer and water treatment plant that's already been designed for the next 75 years doesn't make sense to me. Perhaps the other SDCs like streets, those things have to continually be rebuilt and expanded and things. But just trying to figure out, trying to keep more tools in the toolbox instead of eliminating them.
All right, thank you, Scott. So I'm just going to try to quickly sum up what I've heard. One, I think, strong support for scaling SDCs, which is something the city's already moving forward with. So that's great. I think generally the folks who commented on deferral were fairly supportive of that, although recognize that it's not necessarily going to help publicly funded projects. It could help others, and we want to make sure it doesn't hurt them or create a barrier or an impediment. So I think there's some really good comments about just sort of how that gets implemented. Some of those details are going to be important to consider. Heard kind of mixed reviews on exemptions. I think what I heard was from some folks, exemptions would be important for certain types of housing, either publicly funded and or certain types of housing the city wants to encourage development of, or there's not a lot of other incentive-based sort of strategies to do that, but also heard concern about pursuing exemptions from other members of the group. So kind of a mixed bag on that. We'll have to think about that one further as we kind of move forward on this. And so, yeah, that's what I think I've heard. Just a really quick kind of time check. This has been, I think that comments and discussion has been awesome. We are sort of on track not to finish getting through all these. So I'm just going to kind of note that, and we'll have, I don't want to sort of stifle conversation or discussion because it's been really helpful for us. But just note that we may not get through all of the strategies today. And we'll have to, as a team, kind of figure out how to get feedback from you on stuff we don't get through. So I'm just kind of putting that out there as a heads up. So with that,
Matt, I think the next strategy should go pretty quickly, but then I do think we want to spend time, of course, on construction excise tax and go bonds. And I sort of wonder if maybe we can go through both of those strategies before and then discuss them both together, since they're both different, potential funding sources.
Sure.
That might be one way to kind of get through things a little faster.
All right, that's a great idea. We will do that. Okay, so this one, expedited permitting for affordable or needed housing. This is really about kind of saying, hey, for certain projects, the city will commit to a reduced time period for particularly that kind of land use permitting and review process. So that can have a positive impact, again, on reducing costs, particularly kind of carrying costs for development. In terms of the kind of the challenges or barrier side, I guess, it can be fairly limited. Those benefits are not huge because it's not really reducing hard costs. It's just kind of reducing the costs associated with the time. It can be challenging for city staff to meet those expedited timelines. Because they're reviewing a lot of different development applications, so that can be a challenge. And then also it depends on cooperation with other departments, so it just can make it difficult. There's already some provisions related to expedited review of applications associated with kind of qualifying affordable housing, so that's something the city already needs to do per state statute. But going much further than that can be challenging. And so for that reason, so far, this is identified as kind of a relatively low priority, given the kind of cost benefit analysis we've done here, even though it's kind of qualitative. Next one. So, really the question here is just, does that make sense that this is a relatively low priority unless the planning department really has more capacity to do this, and recognizing that the city, is already kind of working hard to review these applications in a timely manner and still have to meet statutory requirements around that. So, Erin.
Yeah, I agree. It would be fantastic, but it's not as high of a priority as some other pieces. And often publicly funded affordable housing projects, they don't close their funding until after a lot of these processes have taken place. And so the investment from a financial side is fairly low. Again, I would love it. It'd be amazing. And I don't think it would be as important as some of the other ones.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate the perspective on that one. Anybody else on this one?
I did see Alana give a thumbs up to the question. Do you agree? The do you agree question. So
excellent. Thank you, Alana and Kate. All right. You're right, Kate. That one was quick. So we will move on. All right, so we did finish our first category of strategies here. So we'll talk about funding sources. I think, as Kate suggested, I'll kind of go through the slides related to the construction excise tax and the general obligation bonds, and then we'll ask you the questions about those kind of in a combined way, and then kind of move on to these other three after that. So construction excise tax, this is a one-time tax on kind of new construction. And it can be applied to either residential residential can also be applied to commercial or industrial construction. It's the maximum is 1% for residential projects. Other cities around the state have often, when they've adopted this, not applied the full 1%, but applied a 0.5% or other tax. There are some specific statutory requirements for how the funds that result can be used. So 50% need to be used for developer incentives. So that includes what we just talked about, SDC exemptions or tax abatements. And then 15% would go towards state programs for homeowners. The rest, there's flexibility in how it gets allocated or used, the other 35%. Next one. So, sort of pros and cons. It's one of the relatively few sort of specific funding options that the city could adopt in terms of new funding options. It's not a necessarily easy lift to adopt it in terms of just it requires a fair bit of coordination and discussion among housing stakeholders. But once it's in place, it's relatively straightforward to administer. In terms of the downsides of it, it does represent an additional cost to all development at those percentages that we talked about, in the last slide, somewhere between 0 and 1%. And those costs typically do get passed on to tenants. So it does, have some impact on the cost of housing for people who live in the housing. But there can be some offsetting incentives, particularly around if the city were to move forward with any of the SDC exemptions or reductions we talked about, it can be used to offset some of that. So that can reduce some of those impacts to some degree. So we did do kind of a quick estimate of what the city might expect to see in revenues associated with a CET. We looked at it in terms of some different rates of revenues and whether or not, or different rates of the tax and whether or not that would be applied to just residential or to residential and commercial. So you can kind of look at this as this could be anywhere from $90,000 a year to $700,000 a year, depending on how this is applied and at what percentage. And this assumes continued development at a certain rate, you know, similar to what the city's been seeing in previous years.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
It's Mayor Johnson.
Yep.
It says on this thing you put up here for us, 15% goes to state. What is the reason for that, and why would we accept something like this?
I'm going to say you don't have a lot of choice about accepting it because it's the state law. And
my question is that, so we tax our developers for building within our city limits. The state says give us 15% of that.
That's true.
How do they justify?
So that's a great question. I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know sort of how the state came up with that requirement or exact. That's something we can follow up with you, I think, unless anybody else on the group knows the answer to that question. I think we need to follow up after this because I don't know the answer in terms of when they put this program or authorized this taxation program, like what their rationale was for the 15%. I'm guessing it's just sort of spreading some of the revenues at the local level back out to the state for kind of, I would say equity or, you know, sort of fair share purposes. But beyond that, I don't know. Anne has her hand up. She might have the answer.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a lot of details, but the money goes to the states to support homeowner programs. So the state gives out a lot of funding. Aaron's mentioned publicly supported projects, but it would support homeownership programs. And I would point out that rates can be different for commercial, industrial versus residential. So a lot of cities, most of the cities we've researched have a higher tax on commercial, industrial, and a lower tax on residential. It isn't necessarily the same, but anyway, that's all I'll say. We can provide a little bit more on how the funds have been used to date if we can get that kind of information, but it came with the legislation which enabled this funding source for cities.
Yeah, and just to build on that a tiny bit, some of that money going to the state ultimately comes back to the local level at whether it's at that 15%. We couldn't tell you today, but we can try to get some more information about this as a follow-up.
What cities that are comparative to Albany have adopted this CET?
I can sort of rattle off a few, but I can't tell you all of them. I'm pretty sure Eugene has. I know that Tigard has. I know that Bend has. I believe Redmond has as well. All of those I would call, you know, relatively comparable to Albany in terms of sort of size. So those are some of them. Yeah, and I'm gonna just see if there's any other quick questions for clarification, or if anybody who has their hand up, like Anne or Aaron, wants to respond in terms of answering the question. Otherwise, I want to do the description of the other strategy and then have our sort of discussion about this, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, page 15 of the report that you received, it lists all the cities: Grants Pass, Medford, Milwaukee, Corvallis, Cannon Beach, Newport, Hood River, Bend, Eugene, Tigard, and Portland. And more other cities are currently proposing the CET. So yes, cities smaller than us and similar in size have the CET.
I got a handful of them. All right, Aaron, did you have anything just to add to the?
No, it's okay. I was going to point out exactly what Anne just did. So, okay.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Any other questions for clarification before we talk about general obligation bonds and then have some more discussion about these? Okay. So general obligation bonds is another funding source. I will say there's not a lot of communities around the state who have implemented this one. Essentially, this was done in the Portland metro region for the entire metro region, and then that money is being used by all the cities in the metro region. It's actually it's going primarily through the counties and their housing authorities in terms of how that money is getting allocated. But essentially it requires a vote of the people to approve authorization of those general obligation bonds. And then there's a fair bit of flexibility in terms of how the money can be used. And that's something the city would, determine as part of the program. So it can be used to acquire land. It can be used to provide grant funds for specific types of projects. It can be used to purchase existing, essentially kind of what we sometimes call naturally occurring affordable housing to maintain its affordability level, make it permanent. So there's lots of ways this money can be used. It can result in a pretty substantial pool of revenue. And that's really the biggest pro here or benefit. And again, just sort of the flexibility of how it can be used. So those are kind of the primary benefits. The cons, pretty big lift in terms of it requires voter approval. So you've got to kind of go through all the steps of putting together a ballot initiative and informing people about, why the city wants to do this. And then it can really just be used for kind of capital projects or acquisition of land or acquisition of existing housing. Can't be used for supportive services or operations. So do we have any more on the description of this one? Okay, so the question on this one is, do you think this is something the city should consider pursuing moving forward? And then the questions on the CET, maybe jump back up since we said we'd talk about these in concert. Somewhat similar question on CET, is this something the city should consider adopting in the future? If so, should it apply to just residential and commercial or industrial property? What's the appropriate percentage? Recognizing that the cap is 1% on residential, but it can be higher on commercial or industrial development. And if the city were to pursue this, what are the income levels that ought to benefit from it in terms of relationship to average median income? So those are the questions. So please give us your thoughts on both CET and general obligation bonds. And Sharon, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, okay. So I have always been in support of construction excise tax. And I knew that from when Corvallis had implemented theirs years back. But I'm disappointed to know that 50% is really only for projects, and that other 50 is for programs or goes back to the states. So that to me is very disappointing to see, but I think it'd be such a great tool for nonprofits that are wanting to be able to build a new project to be able to have an additional source of funding. And that to me fills that big gap that is needed instead of looking at SDCs or some of the other funding we've been looking at. The GO bond, did you want to discuss that piece now? Okay. That part, originally I was in support of going out for the general obligation bond, but a different approach to that. It's called just letting a project purchase municipal bonds. We had that tool years back, and that was basically hospital authority. They could be able to, expansion of anything with hospitals, use municipal bonds where they got the interest rate cheaper, and then you had less cumbersome, say, if you're trying to go through a commercial bank on projects. This would be a great tool for low-income housing projects and nonprofits to be able to go through a city and be able to purchase municipal bonds. So for a general obligation bond, that would have to be voter approved, and every taxpayer would be, contributing to it. I just think that's just going down a path that is very challenging to try to get that passed. But if we could find a tool for purchasing municipal bonds, I think would be great.
All right, thank you, Sharon.
Mhm.
Maybe one quick clarification, and Anne might have some comments on this too. So at least 50% of the revenues from a CET needs to be used for developer incentives. The 15% needs to go to the state. The other 35% can be used flexibly, and I think it might be that you could put more than 50% into the incentives, pulling from some of that 35%. I don't know if that's for sure true. We can check on it. But Anne, did you have anything to clarify on that?
That was exactly what I was gonna bring up. It's flexibility for affordable housing programs as defined by the city. So maybe rather than a developer incentives, it could be, anything addressing affordable housing, and it could be supporting publicly, a variety of stuff. And, we would look at what the needs are and how to make best use of those funds and get those out the door into the community. So 85% would go to support affordable housing and 15% would go to the state, but some of that money flows back to the city. So, or to projects in the city.
Right. So, Anne, when it says programs though, then couldn't somebody put in a pitch that would be paid, basically going for an operations and not as capital?
No, not necessarily, because we would be defining what those programs are. So,
okay, then that'd be great to go that route, to get to an established CET, to me, long as it was going towards capital. So great, thank you.
Yeah, good clarifications on that. Cameron, what do you have?
So, yeah, I just kind of wanted to agree with what's already been said. I'm skeptical of general obligation bonds. If someone's already living here on a fixed income, they're not going to want to have to pay out of their limited funds, on passed down property taxes if they own a small home. But if you do a construction excise tax where you're not taxing people that are already living here, then that's a way to support, funding for SDC exemptions, for example, other housing affordability programs. 85% can go directly to housing affordability if you want it to. 15% goes to the state, but that still goes into housing affordability in the state, then funneled to the city. It's just not necessarily, may or may not be regulated by the city, but some of those funds probably would go back to the city. So the CET to me does make sense to do the 1%. I do like the 60%, 80% AMI for apartments and for supporting, small entry-level single-family homes. And I also think that this should be towards commercial and industrial as well. So it may be even more than 1%. So it's not limited to 1%. We may want to look at 2-3% on commercial and industrial projects. So I'm supportive of the CET.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Cameron. Alana.
I haven't pulled comprehensive analysis on this, but I have, from the properties that I have looked at, Albany property taxes are higher than Corvallis property taxes, and Albany property taxes seem pretty high on the individual. The other thing that I wanted to mention, or the main thing that I want to mention, granted that I don't know if it's possible or legal, but I've brought it up before, and I'm curious towards the city and consulting folks. Has it been explored? Can you figure out if it's legal or possible to do a tax on cash purchases of houses and purchases of houses that come from, say, hedge funds or, not individuals that are going to live there? Can we, as a city, apply a really high tax on those things and send it directly to affordable housing?
So I don't know if we know the answer to that question. I think it's related to one of the strategies that's in the really long list of strategies we started out looking at early on. So I'm going to just see if Kate has anything to add to that one. No.
I don't even think this was in that initial list. I think this was suggested by Alana and maybe some of the other task force members. And I think we maybe discussed it, but the sort of legality of it is questionable. We have not done in-depth research onto that topic.
Yeah, it has come up in other communities we've worked in, and when it has, I think we have had some fairly significant questions about the legality of it, but we aren't, partly because we're not land use and sort of tax attorneys, we haven't done any kind of in-depth analysis. We can kind of put a feeler out to other communities and see if anybody has, but we don't have an answer now, I guess. It's a fair question, but no answer at the moment. And so
I guess part
Yeah.
of that inquiry is also like, can you make it a priority to check on the legality of this? And I mean, I saw a bunch of heads nodding and I think there's popular support if we can figure out how to work it.
We can certainly put out some feelers with, again, I think the state, see if they know of any research, the folks at the Department of Land Conservation and Development, see if they know of any research on this. There's a thing called the Oregon Planners Network. So yeah, we can put a couple of queries out to them, I think, and also maybe the city attorney if staff thinks that's a good way to go too. I want to promise that on their behalf. So we can make it a priority to at least make those kind of inquiries. Again, not to do an in-depth analysis, but at least to ask the question. So I think, yes, we can do that. Any other thoughts on these two funding strategies?
Yes, this is Scott Letman again. I think this is a construction excise tax is an absolute mistake. You're burdening housing production and probably industrial or commercial development. I think that's a big mistake. Already, when you do a development, you're buying the land twice because you're paying SDCs. So there's a huge disincentive. You're buying the land and then you got to pay SDCs, and now you have a construction excise tax. And looking at, even in good times, the small amount of money it generates, it doesn't move the dial. If the community wants affordable housing significantly, have them vote on it. Let everyone in the community pay for it. And the advantage of that is it could be a nominal amount, very small, and be included on their water and sewer bills, not necessarily a tax. So, and I'm not sure the mechanism for that, but I would, if you want affordable housing, significant affordable housing, pissing off developers, not a good idea. And you're just making housing more unaffordable. So if the community wants affordable housing, if you look at the numbers that the city of Portland was able to generate, it's not a little bit of money, it's significant. So.
Matt, you got it.
Figured it out. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the comments. Anybody else? And then I'll just kind of do a quick summary of what I've heard from folks so far on these. All right. So I'm going to say what I heard was some kind of mixed comments on this, some support for the CET from a couple of folks who spoke up, some concern or opposition from Scott. I would say that, yeah, I would definitely require some further discussion with the development community. The city would want to do that before they move forward with something like this. I think what I heard on the general obligation bonds was big lift. On the one hand, the positive side is it could raise a more significant amount of money, but it also, for good or ill, would fall kind of on the, let's say, pocketbooks of everybody across the city. There's both pros and cons associated with that. And it's just a big lift in terms of moving it forward. So I think some concern about just, how high a priority that should be. So that's what I've heard from folks. I think, we can reflect all of that in the recommendations we continue to refine and move forward with. So, all right. Thank you for the comments on those two. So next one is tax increment financing. So tax increment financing, this is also often referred to, and is for many years was referred to as urban renewal. So, you know, this is a mechanism where future tax revenues in a specific area get essentially diverted to pay for improvements within that area, as opposed to being used sort of citywide. That's kind of how this works very generally. It can be used to support affordable housing or housing through acquiring properties, through paying for improvements, you know, right-of-way improvements or other improvements that support or reduce the cost of that housing development, or paying for development fees. So this is a very common strategy used by cities across the state generally, and including within Albany. And maybe next slide. So Albany has an existing TIF district or urban renewal district. It's you know, it's a good tool in areas where development or redevelopment is anticipated, or where the city is really trying to encourage that. You know, on the con side, it foregoes revenue into overlapping districts or other areas of the cities. But, you know, it can and should help the city ultimately grow its tax base by supporting development in the area within the tax increment financing boundary. The other sort of con side is just you don't immediately get revenue. It takes time for the development to occur that creates the tax base that produces the revenue. So it's more of a kind of medium to long-term strategy in terms of generating revenue that's then used for the activities that the city would decide to use it for within the boundary. So next one. So the question is just, you know, we identified this one as a kind of a medium priority. Should the city consider potentially a new TIF district? And if so, assume that a portion of the revenues are used to help cover the cost in some way of future affordable housing development. And again, I kind of talked about the different ways that could happen. So yeah, Sharon.
Well, this, I really don't think we should even go down this path. It would be one big hard sell to all the voters to be able to establish a district that's basically going to be for a housing area. So when we did, you kind of have to ask, if you're going to the voters, who's going to benefit from this? And when we did our, CARA for our urban renewal, the benefit was revitalizing the downtown. That was the heart of the community. And everyone citywide, it's going to be on their tax bill. And everyone basically can go downtown, or they can go shopping, or they can go to a restaurant. So they get to go in physically into those buildings. But if you're going to target a certain area and it's just for housing, taxpayers can't go into those houses. What do they really benefit from? It would end up benefiting to get some lower income housing, but to get that passed by the voters citywide would be a hard sell. So I know Portland did it, but Portland was very dire need, and with their homelessness and lower income, they really needed to be able to, not with TIF, they did it with the construction excise tax. So it's easier, or that general obligation bond, it's easier to pass it by the voters. But for us and for Albany, we've had challenging times to justify our current CARA. And it's been, 21 years of kind of a battle that I don't even think we should go down this path. So that's my opinion on it.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. And just kind of clarify a little bit. I think we're not necessarily suggesting that the city establish a new TIF district solely for housing, but does the city want to consider creating one that has potentially multiple benefits, but that one of the explicit or stated benefits is related to affordable housing? So not necessarily 100% the revenues are used just for that, but that a portion of the revenues might be used for that. So I just want to kind of clarify.
Right. I think, well, we're on regular, except for the East Albany area, for where there was challenging for some housing. well, if it is going to be going for just for housing, that would be a hard sell, you know, to the, you know, to the taxpayer citywide. So, but just my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else have thoughts on this one?
Sharon, just as an alternative, because I love financial engineering, if a property's on the tax roll and you just exempted the taxes on that property, what I mean that doesn't make any sense. The property's on the tax roll, it's paying taxes, but instead of using the taxes to fund the community and all the other things, it provides an interest rate buy down, something similar to your trying to get I think nursing bonds, I think is what you said. So you can go to the market, get, hospital bonds. You could get, you can use that tax money to do a interest rate buy down to provide housing. So it wouldn't be, you're creating housing. It wouldn't be a burden on the community in the sense that no one else in the community would have to pay for anything. It just, you'd have to subsidize the, you know, the fire department and police department attending. That it'd be a nominal cost, but the amount of the taxes that would be generated by that property still be paid, but be funneled for an interest rate buy down to make the project financially feasible. Anyway.
Right. So
sorry.
Scott, for with TIF though, it shows up on everyone's citywide tax bill, and that's the part that's would be hard because you'd have to get a new TIF passed by the voters. So that would be the challenging piece to it. It's basically in that TIF district is those properties in there are contributing. Their cost is going into the TIF fund, which takes it away from police and fire and other services in that district. But it does get spread out citywide on everyone's tax bills. So it's a very challenging path to go down is what I'm just trying to say on that.
All right. All right. Thank you, everybody. So I think, you know, good pointing out just some of the challenges with this one. And I think, you know, that's partly why it's kind of we identified it as a medium priority, and if it's something the city considers, it's really more of a medium to long-term strategy, not something that would be implemented right away. So just kind of a quick time check. We've got one more of these funding strategies to talk about. And then we've got the public-private partner or the partnership strategies. And do you know if we have anybody that's not a committee member that we think might want to give us comments as part of this meeting? I'm just trying to figure out how much time to devote to.
The only non-committee member here is Billy Mcgregor from Cascades West. It sounds like he's just listening in. So I think we can keep moving forward. Okay. I don't see any other public. Thanks for asking.
Great. So we'll cover demolition taxes, which is the last one we're going to talk about under funding. And then I think our plan for the partnerships category one, it's for Kate to cover those. And I think we really have sort of general questions about that category. So our plan was to describe them all at the same time and then come back and ask you some general questions about them. So I think we'll just do that as quickly as we can and get as much as we can done before 1 o'clock. So, and again, I just want to say great discussion so far on all of these. So the last one under funding is demolition taxes. This is a tax when somebody demolishes a house to sort of basically discourage that to a degree, you know, encourage retaining an existing home rather than say you tear down a smaller currently affordable house and then you build something that's really not affordable. It's a higher cost, higher priced house. So the kind of benefit or intent is to help preserve some of the city's existing housing that's currently less expensive. On the other hand, you know, sort of the con is there there is maybe and is housing in certain areas of the city or just certain houses that truly are dilapidated or substandard or unhealthy and are not great for basically the people living there and around them. So it kind of potentially deters replacement of some of those homes. Not a ton of cities around the state who have done this, but one example is Lake Oswego. They established a demolition tax in 2019. So I won't read all of the stuff here about kind of how theirs works, but it does include some exceptions for certain types of homes. So I think, the question here is, do you think this is a good idea? Should the city consider establishing a demolition tax? So I'd love to hear any comments people might have on this. Cameron.
So I'm a very strong supporter of demolition taxes. It's not just about raising revenue. A huge part of this is preserving existing affordable housing stock inventory, which kind of ties into the next section 5.2. There's a large number of post-World War II minimum traditional ranch type houses in this city back when they built on larger lots. And those are increasingly becoming targets for tear downs and replacing with more expensive housing. These places are not demolished to build a more affordable place in their stead. They are demolished for profit generation, for flipping to a larger house, or it can be even multifamily, but it's not affordable multifamily. So, it's already happening in Albany. As you drive around, I know several places that I've looked at that were for sale and were bought and then scraped out and replaced with a larger house. In most cases, it's a larger house. Sometimes it's a duplex, but generally speaking, it's a larger house, which then reduces the affordable stock inventory. These houses, again, minimal traditionals, those early ranches, that is Albany's small housing inventory. These houses are typically between, 800 to say 1,500 square feet. A lot of them are around 1,000 square feet. This is our existing entry-level single-family homes. They're not building houses of size anymore. Now, some of the strategies we do here will hopefully increase the supply, but right now we're demolishing entry-level single-family homes faster than we're building them in this town, and we need to put a stop to that. And so, do we need to do this? Absolutely. And I also think that if it's replaced by multifamily, they don't get a get out of jail free card. It needs to be only if it's, if a duplex or multifamily, whatever, that it's less than say 80% AMI. Because otherwise, you can tear down a single family home, split the lot, or build a duplex. It's very high end. That happens a lot in Portland, where they'll tear down a home and they'll put a large condo on there, and each condo will sell for what the original single family home used to do, because these are now all luxury, because the developer is trying to maximize profit, not provide affordable housing. And so, again, I think we should do this, and it should be tied, obviously, not just to also a more expensive single family home that replaces it, but also looking at if it's multifamily, is that going to be affordable multifamily or not?
All right. Thank you, Cameron. And I see that Alana had given us a thumbs up on this one as well. Looks like Matthew has a comment, and then Sharon, and then we'll see if anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak quickly about I'm not speaking in support of or against the demolition tax. I just want to make sure that we have accurate information. If this is something that the group is actually interested in pursuing, I get concerned when I hear statements about, I'm not trying to take anything away from what Mr. Selmeyer said, but one of the statements was that there's more homes being demolished and rebuilt than there are being built new. I don't think that's an accurate statement, but we can certainly get some numbers of demos that we've seen over the last couple of years and what's being put back. So just so there's accurate information, if this is something the group is interested in pursuing.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. Sharon, what do you have?
I fully agree with Cameron on it. I think this tax is needed. We have seen some historic properties demolished that could have been, rehab. So I fully agree with this one.
All right, thank you. Anybody else on this one? I think, the folks, we heard from a fair bit of support for this one. So I appreciate those comments on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to talk about comments from the conference. Yeah, go for it.
There should be no demolition tax if you want homes that are older, right? Provide an incentive for the homeowner to fix it up, but it's their property. There's already enough rules related to the police power of the state to regulate your own property. If the building is obsolete, then let the homeowner make a decision what they want to do with the property to their own advantage. They wouldn't be doing it unless they thought it was helpful to the market.
All right, thank you, Scott. I am going to turn it over to Kate. We got about 11 minutes left. We're going to reserve 1 minute for next steps. So you get 10 minutes, Kate. Sorry.
All right, we'll see how this goes. Well, I think we were planning to kind of go through these strategies fairly quickly anyway, just because these tend to be either they're sort of lower priority because the city just wouldn't necessarily play a sort of direct role in implementing these, kind of more supporting these strategies, or we just don't see like really strong potential for implementing these, at least in the near term. So the first one is public-private partnerships, which are, arrangements between the city and other either non-profit or for-profit partners to develop housing, including affordable housing. It's kind of a wide variety of different types of public-private partnerships out there. One of which is a community land trust model, which is something we've talked about before. So community land trust is this specific kind of ownership model where the community organization owns the land and then provides a long-term ground lease to the homeowner who purchases the home itself, with income restrictions. So it can only be owned by, lower income households. And then that household is able to, become a homeowner in a situation where they might not otherwise have the opportunity, and they're able to capture some of the equity as the home, gains value over time. But it would ensure that the home would remain affordable over the long term for future home buyers if they move on to a different situation. So we identified kind of some options for ways that the city could potentially support a CLT. And of course, we know that Dev Northwest is one of the organizations working in this area that part of what they do is to operate kind of CLT model homes. And so one would be donating city-owned land to a CLT, providing grants or low interest loans for specific, development or rehab projects, providing down payment assistance for homes owned by CLTs, and providing direct funding. And of course, these are all kind of contingent on the city having funding, either funding or properties that they can contribute to a CLT. And that would kind of depend on some of the other strategies we've talked about, because the existing kind of funding sources to support this are pretty limited. That's one. I'm going to keep going. See, that was 2 minutes. All right. This next strategy is really kind of another kind of grouping of strategies that are kind of geared towards maintaining housing affordability or keeping existing residents in their homes. So financial assistance programs like rent assistance, homeowner loans. These are, many of these are funded through existing community development block grant, the community development block grant program in Albany, which is something that I think we skipped over. I'm not sure how that happened. But we didn't really get much into it because it's kind of a lower priority. It's something the city's already doing and doesn't have much opportunity to kind of expand that program. So that's kind of something that's ongoing. This is kind of just continuing the city's support for those programs. Preserving low-cost housing. There's a variety of ways that this could could take place through acquisition, loans, grants. The state OH, Oregon Housing, I'm not sure what OHCS stands for. They have a naturally occurring affordable housing loan fund currently, so that, you know, it's not really something that's under the city's control, but it is an existing fund in Oregon. Preserving manufactured home parks. This is another strategy for, you know, this is an existing source of low cost housing that's already out there in the community, and the city could, you know, approach or support various efforts to maintain that affordability through, you know, supporting community purchase of those homes. OHCS also supports these programs through existing funding at the state level. And then an affordable housing preservation inventory. This is something that the city could do to inventory the existing either subsidized or just lower cost housing that's out there in the community, just to see where opportunities are for preservation. I'm seeing a couple of hands up, including Anne. Let's go to Anne first, and then Farron, unless you have a clarifying question, I might ask you to hold your comment until the end of this.
And I'm just going to say we are going to completely run out of time for discussion.
Yeah. So
I'm just going to note that.
We do have a list of our publicly supported housing units, and I mean, I can try to do something with property values to do, you know, we can easily do that inventory, and I'll let others keep things moving.
Okay, thanks, Anne. All right. Providing information and education to small developers. This is just a kind of a way to share information in maybe a more accessible format than what the city already does, to support kind of smaller scale builders and developers who might not be as familiar with kind of city processes and things like that. And it could also be targeted specifically to support accessible design or universal design practices, which again, you know, might not be as available to sort of smaller scale builders. So we've got kind of a range of strategies that we identified here. This is really just kind of dependent on sort of staff time and capacity to kind of put those materials together. This could be a bigger conversation, this one about conversion of underperforming or distressed commercial assets. This is just, you know, converting existing, you know, non-residential buildings into, you know, putting them into residential use. And I think there's quite a few challenges to this strategy, including, you know, building code, not, you know, the kind of the mismatch between commercial and residential building codes, and older development being kind of out of compliance with the code. There are a lot of sort of financing challenges with this, and just city does not, well, for one, they don't have a lot of existing commercial vacancies. So, and really staff just has sort of limited resources to take the lead on this strategy, but it could be something that the city might be able to support, sort of a private or nonprofit developer taking this sort of thing on. And then the last thing is a housing trust fund, which is really just a way of kind of, it's a dedicated fund that isn't creating a new revenue source, but it's kind of collecting those revenues and deciding and planning for how those funds are spent to support affordable housing. So there's several examples in Oregon, including in Ashland and Eugene, and those are, you know, supported by funding sources such as a construction excise tax, or maybe even a general obligation bond to support that. Okay, so let's see, we have 3 minutes left.
I'm gonna just maybe make a statement and maybe suggestion. So Kate and I have to leave at 1.
Yeah.
But if Anne and other folks on the task force are available to stick around for an extra, you know, 10 minutes or so, or however much time you have, and talk about these, kind of go and talk about these discussion questions, I think that would be great. So Anne, are you available? I can't remember who had a hard stop at 1. I know Kate and I did.
I am free. Yeah, I know that others may have obligations, but yeah, so let's just have you guys wrap up, and we'll just take it from there. We may do what we did last time, where we send out, you know, opportunity to provide comments on any of those strategies, and especially those we didn't completely get to. So
yeah, let's just, people that can stick around, maybe, you know, give it an extra 10 minutes and you might just see Kate and I disappear from the screen, and apologies for that. But I've got to be in Sisters, Oregon at a planning commission meeting at 4 o'clock. So I leave soon. Anyway, so I'll stop talking, and yeah, I'd love to hear from you and as much time as you can devote to this.
So Alana, go ahead. You've got your hands up.
Just noting that I know that the city has a very like linear and specific plan for this task force. And also I would be available to attend an extra meeting and have opportunity for a little more emergent conversation with the task force.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I'm probably going to stop sharing my screen and drop off because I maybe need to use the restroom before I jump into my next meeting. So thanks, everyone.
I'll finish up this one.
Is the gentleman from the LCDC here still here?
I think, I'm not sure if Patrick is still here. He might have jumped off already.
I don't see his name on the screen.
Yeah, but if you guys have comments, I've been taking notes the whole time. I'm trying to mute myself when I'm typing, so I'm not making too much noise. Any thoughts on the public-private partnerships and all the different strategies that just were shared? As Kate mentioned, they're sort of ones that we try to support as much as we can already, given some limitations, and many other organizations or sort of lead on some of these strategies. But I am ready to take some notes if anyone has comments. Cameron?
So I guess I'll just start off with some of my initial thoughts. It's kind of a lot to go through real quickly. Public-private partnerships, yeah, that makes sense. Be a good use of the CIT funds, or, you know, if we do scaled SDCs, that kind of stuff. And then, you know, I'm a big supporter of supporting the existing affordable housing for residents. Existing affordable housing, you know, it doesn't take a developer to make it. It's already there. It's just a matter of trying to protect it. Financial assistance programs for first-time home buyers, trying to get into a small affordable home, but then more importantly, trying to protect those small affordable homes, preserving them, acquisition, low-cost funds, you know, restoration of some of these small affordable homes. Instead of demolishing them, if we have a program that can work towards restoring it so that it stays a viable and useful entry-level home, I think is useful. And then also the preserving, you know, the housing inventory. I don't think that we have a good handle on what our stock of existing entry-level homes is. I know there's quite a bit, you know, in certain areas of town. Again, these tend to be the areas that were developed World War II to, you know, around mid 1960s or so. Looking at those and protecting those, I think as affordable housing is a useful thing for the city to do. You know, some of the other ideas in here, they're not bad ideas. I just don't know that they're going to be quite as useful as the first two. So that's my very quick comments on it.
Thank you. And we are doing some of those already. Any other thoughts on these? And I can share my screen if that's helpful. I've got the presentation. I could share that. Sometimes it's nice to see each other. So just let me know if you'd like me to pull up the list of strategies. I can do that.
I think yeah.
So in commenting on what Cameron's thought is that by keeping existing dwellings more affordable, because their values are going to rise and fall, or the rents are going to rise and fall with the general supply or demand in the market. So I don't know that keeping the existing supply of homes as is, it will make that big a difference. But I'm interested in the public-private partnership. If we know that creating affordable housing isn't economically efficient for public folks to build it. I would like to explore how public-private partnership would work. I think that's fascinating, but beyond the scope of the meeting here. The next thing I'm really curious about is trying to create more housing generally. And one of the things that's odd to me is why the tort laws for building condominiums and attached housing hasn't been addressed. That's why I was hoping that the gentleman from LCDC was still here. Attached housing isn't being built, and the reason why it isn't being built is because when it's been built, well, you can't get it insured. You can't get it insured because all you need is a tort lawyer 9 years before the 10th year when there's a construction defect suing you for one window that's in a 100-unit apartment building, and they'll actually go out and solicit homeowners associations. If there was tort claim or tort lawsuit limitations for building attached housing, that would encourage building attached housing. And in addition to that, and I know apartment builders, they don't build a detached or attached housing anymore. And the reason why is because of that. If they own the property, they're not going to sue themselves. Once they sell the property, then they could be potentially sued. So I would hope that you could reach out, and you could reach out to this guy at LCDC about that.
Yep.
And
I think
ask him.
yeah. I will. I know that several folks in the housing industry know that condominium laws need to be reevaluated. I think the Home Builders Association is aware of that and lobbying the state and just getting that on a legislative priority. Maybe we could let League of Oregon Cities know, but yes, and I was taking notes too about that. So sorry if you heard my typing.
And it isn't just new stuff. You could instantly create all the apartments could be condos instantly, right? With the changes in state land use laws and legal laws. So that would instantly add a lot of supply. And another reason why I like that is I think it gives more people the opportunity to gain equity in home ownership. If you have a 100-unit apartment building that's owned by a property manager, the people that living there aren't as invested in the community as it would be if there was 100 people owning 100 condos. I think it's better for everyone living there, and I think it's better for the community.
We would agree. Any opportunity for home ownership and earning equity. And yeah, if you can also reach out to your folks, Home Builders Association, your legislatures. I mean, it's kind of going to take a multi-pronged approach, and DLCD has a big agenda. But I know that they're aware of this, on the housing side and Oregon housing as well. But I think it needs to come from the community too. So, and it may be. Any other thoughts before we wrap up? Farron has her hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I've been so quiet today. I feel like I am absorbing a lot and wishing very much I had gotten more involved in this group much earlier on in your meetings process so that I wasn't absorbing things as you guys are more than halfway through your timeline of meeting. And I unfortunately need to go. I've got a homeless single mom outside my office who could use some support, and that's what I do. So off I go. Have a good day, guys.
Yeah, if there isn't any other business, thanks, Farron. Our emails and phone lines and doors are always open, and you can send your comments and thoughts on these strategies. And I do think since we've lost most everybody, we don't have enough people here really, but we do want you to continue to provide your comments and thoughts on this, and we're going to be taking all that in consideration as we look at what to bring out to the public for their feedback, which is one of the next steps, and also bringing it to the Planning Commission and Council in a work session. So after we get their thoughts, we we'll be meeting with you again before things get wrapped up. With that, I thank you guys for your time today. Anything else for the good of the order? Okay, well, thanks, everybody. Have a good
Thank you.
Thursday.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Anne. Yeah.
You're
thanks.
welcome. Good
Take
to
care.
see everybody in person. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.